Good morning. Is it morning? Good morning. How is everyone? It's hard to follow that. That was very motivational, and emergency managers have to be motivational, and I'm going to touch a little bit on that in this presentation this morning. I did get in at about 2:30. I put my head down on the pillow at 2:30 this morning. I left out of Baltimore, went through Atlanta, and my wife is actually still back at Emmitsburg at UEMA. We debuted this week the pilot project, or the pilot Leadership Academy 2 course. And if you're not very familiar with what FEMA's working on, it's really pretty impressive over the next several years. You've got 3 essential academies for emergency managers that are going to be available, a certified program through FEMA. It's really impressive. You're going to have the Foundations Academy, and I met several people in the room here through that Foundation Academy that was taught here last year, and I think probably led to me being invited here this morning. The second one is the Leadership Academy, which I can guarantee you that all of you should be in and qualify for. The third one, and they're 4-week courses, and the fourth one, or the third one, excuse me, is the Executive Academy for those senior level, true hardcore decision makers with a lot of management and leadership experience needed. And those academies are rocking and rolling back in Washington, D.C. and Emmitsburg. It was 2 below, and you guys deal with cold, okay? And I live 25 miles northeast of Seattle, and it's mild, it's beautiful, but it's, you know, it's rainy, but you guys deal with cold. But it was 2 below back there, and the wind was blowing about 25 miles per hour. And I've done North Pole, Alaska, Barrow, Kaktovik, Alaska. I've been in cold, but it had been a while, and I'd forgotten what insulated underwear is for. So I was really chilly back on the East Coast. So it's nice to be here around freezing temperatures and see some snow. Okie doke. Well, Sheila, let's see. You talked about how we got into emergency management, and I'm going to chat in a minute about how I got into emergency management. We all have those very unique stories. You had your letter that was out to the membership in the portfolio that we have, the brochure, talks a little bit of how we kind of back into it, and I'll touch on that. The Commissioner, Department of Public Safety, his remarks this morning were so apropos to what I'm going to talk about, because we're going back into an era, and we're moving back in emergency management to a time that maybe was a little bit simpler, maybe a little bit good. I'm going to take us this morning into the weeds, not so technical that you're a hazmat specialist, and then I'm going to pull us back to that 100,000-foot level. I'm going to take us out of the box a little bit in the way that we think, say a few things that I believe need to be said, need to be thrown on the table as emergency management professionals, and let's just see how it goes. The first thing I wanted to share with you is how kind of screwed up it's all gotten. I'm pretty blunt. So, in 2004, I was in Juneau at the Governor's Homeland Security Conference, and I was slated as the keynote there. And if you've never been to Juneau, there's not a lot to do. There's about 30,000 people, but it's very cultured, very, I think, just a wonderful community. For Southeast Alaska, remote, but 30,000 cultured, lots of ships coming into the harbor. And I was going to keynote the next day, but I was kind of bored. I was just sitting around in my hotel room overlooking everything. It was beautiful. And I just happened to look down and see the FEMA FAT book, the frequent acronyms, terminology, the FAT book. Some of you know it. And actually, let's get this out of the way first. I'm sorry. How many FEMA, is anybody here from FEMA? Okay. All right. That's going to make my job a lot easier. It's going to give you the ability to laugh a little bit louder. So FEMA, and how many federal employees? Okay. All right. And I kind of sort of fit that mold still a little bit. And okay. So and then state. I know. Ooh. Okay. We're going to be okay. Okay. So back to 2004. I was sitting in Juneau and kind of bored, looking at the acronym book, thinking this is ridiculous. So I just kind of sat off on my laptop to start writing how ridiculous I thought acronyms were. And I came up with this, and you're going to understand it because you're in emergency management. But what I would ask you to think about as I'm going through this is how outdated, antiquated, or just shoved to the side a lot of these acronyms and terms are now, just since 2004 to today. And I can look around the room, there's a lot of experience here, I can tell. You're going to understand this. There's a lot of federal, a lot of state, a lot of local. You know what you're doing. So here we go. Bear with this. Pretty please. DPS's DEM had called the FEMA RD, who was in the Region 8 RRCC, who was at the time discussing with the RD of DHS an IAIP issue with distinct S&T overtones. It had been reported that near Vancouver, not BC, and Washington, not DC, that a possible IED with WMD capability had been found across the river at PDX, but was headed for SLC. And it therefore required under HSPD 5 that the FRP, NCP, and CON plan be set aside for the NRP, now NRF version 2.0. That in turn forced a PFO from DHS to engage with the FBI SAC and pre-designated FCO at a JFO, not a DFO, near the ICP established by local PD. Understanding the magnitude of the situation, POTUS, President of the United States, through SEC DHS, is that still TBD, by the way? Designated the R10 RD as IPFO, who in turn called the DHS TSA FSD at SLC and PDX, that's the Vancouver, not BC part, through the DD of Region 10's R&R. Meanwhile, the Region 10 NPDD, recognizing the local government impacts, contacted ODP, who promptly engaged the OSLGC and P, which reached out to state tags and local EOCs about SITREPs ASAP. Because the possible IED arriving at SLC from PDX came through a citizen of the UK on a US flight, the SAC of ICE and CBP, now both DHS, worked with DoD to dispatch teams to the ICP from JBLM, though only with help from the DCO. By this time, Region 8 and Region 10 RRCCs had established comms with the DHS HSOC and the FEMA EST to assist the IPFO with potential arrangements of an ERT-in deployment or, worst case, the DEST with FBI concurrence. It was quickly realized, however, that the possible IED with WMD potential would likely require DOE, NIRT, or God forbid, NEST asset, as well as enhanced DoD expertise backup with regional NDMS and MMRC on standby. At 1343 PST, that's 1643 EST, the EST and HSOC notified the IPFO RD, me, through the RRCC that Utah DPS DEM DHS TSA FSD at SLC had indeed been okayed via Northcom direct from the SecDef, DoD IED WMD teams with DHS USAR DMAT DMORT assistance. By 1425 PST, 1725 EST, PD at the ICP, now under ICS and moving towards Unified Command, and did I mention that was one NEMS, one-eyed NEMS, not two-eyed NEMS, notified the FCO, now doubling as the lead on the regional IMT, that he could call the IPFO RD, me, about the IED, which it turned out was little more than fluorescent life vests and dirty underwear loosely packed in the USPS overnighter. In other words, someone's BVDs and a PFD packed with double quilted TP. That's pretty good. So I tell people you can read that in my other books coming out. This book is going to be called The Standard Terminology User Guide and Pronunciation for Interagency Directives. You got that? That's the stupid guide. All right, so that is Juno 2004. How many of you understood that? Yeah, exactly. How many of you understand that a lot of those terms are completely obsolete? Right. That's what we're facing in emergency management. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. How did I get into emergency management? I am genetically damned to be in emergency management. My dad, cop, 42 years. Mom, nurse, 30 years. It was bound to happen, but I backdoored in just like most of you guys. You just don't know you're going to do it until suddenly you're just doing it. And it takes off in the instincts and the background and the things your parents talk to you about and your neighbors, and it just kicks in, and before you know it, you're assistant director, program manager, director, you're doing things in emergency management. It was no different for me. I actually was in the House of Representatives, which was a complete fluke. What essentially happened there was that a guy really honked me off. He had raised my taxes 67%. I did what any 27-year-old red-blooded American male is going to do. I got pissed off and ran against him. And I won. And I had 180,000 people I was representing, and it was a very disaster-prone district. And in this case, if you got Mount St. Helens, you got potential for a volcano blasting off once in a while. We learned that in 2004, much like 1980. And then we had catastrophic floods, and by catastrophic I'm talking about to the point where I-5 is 10 feet underwater. North and southbound corridor in the United States of I-5, 10 feet underwater. So we had issues. But what got me into emergency management full-time, and where those instincts rose to the surface, was with who may or may not be still a sitting United States Senator in either Washington or the state of Washington. You can piece it together from there. And that individual was at a landslide in 1998. Kelso, Washington had the second largest landslide in the history of the United States as far as actual homes that had been impacted. 141 of them that were built in a particular neighborhood of a population of 10,000 and then slid approximately, or in the process of sliding, a quarter mile from where they were built. 141 homes. The economic base of that 10,000 population city, Kelso. They were the economic driver, property taxes essentially. And the challenge with that, with the Stafford Act, which I understood, but I didn't understand it the way that I thought I understood it, was that a slow-moving landslide doesn't qualify under the Stafford Act. So what happened was in July of 1998, I get a phone call from a constituent saying, hey, something's going on with my house. I walk into the kitchen, they put a marble on the kitchen floor, and the marble takes off and doesn't arc. And that's red flag number one. Well, 6 months later, his house was gone. But 2 weeks later, after he showed me the marble, the house was tilting, and the scarp appeared, and another house was starting to move, and it was abundantly clear that something was going on. And the dilemma that we faced was that a federal disaster declaration, a federal disaster reaching that magnitude had not yet occurred. But what was abundantly clear is it was going to occur. But nobody knew when. Was it 6 weeks, 6 months? 141 homes, did that overwhelm the resources of the state of Washington? Possibly, maybe. But here were people who had been red tagged. They had to leave their homes. They couldn't refinance. They couldn't sell it. They had to continue to pay mortgages. The mortgage companies were not helpful in the least, as you can imagine at that point. And here I am, a state legislator, who is trying to figure out what to do. So we ran it up through the state, and the state, to their credit, made a hard run at getting a Stafford Act declaration, and they failed. Said, it's not a disaster yet. We don't know when it will be. In hindsight, we can all go, that kind of makes sense. But if you're carrying that torch for that community, it doesn't make sense at all. And the sitting United States Senator at the time stood beside me in a road with most of these families there, and most of the media over here, and a few other electeds around, and said this: don't you worry, we are going to make you whole. Right. Right. So, ethical dilemma one in my professional life. Do I turn and shake a United States Senator and go, what are you doing? Do I counter her publicly? What do we say to change the expectation that she just placed into the people's minds and their hearts? They were grasping at straws for anything. And suddenly, she said they would be made whole. And we know the reality, don't we? Disasters are disasters for a reason. And what I've learned over this long of a period of time, and many of you have much more experience than I do, is just sometimes brutal honesty with compassion, heartfelt. And the people, even disaster victims, will appreciate that perhaps more than anything else. That's what put me into emergency management full time. That we had been denied the Stafford Act declaration, had nowhere to turn. There was no state system in place. So I went to Washington, D.C. on my own ticket and knocked on the door of 500 C Street, which is FEMA's headquarters, and said, hi, here's my business card. Can I see the director of FEMA? And I look back now and realize how incredibly stupid that was. And yet, the lady looked at me, I think, with such disbelief that she said, hold on. And she went back and she got James Lee Witt. And James Lee Witt came out and said, how you doing? By the way, I was born and raised in Nashville, I've been in the Northwest 24 years. A couple of glasses of wine, you'll know I'm from the South. Okay, so I do Southern accents with legitimacy. how you doing? I said, I'm fine, my people are hurt, can we talk? And he pulled me into this conference room, and we sat for 2.5 hours. Director of FEMA just said, let's talk about it. I laid out the situation, he understood it, he understood the dilemma that the agency faced, because they hadn't been faced with this very much. And we kind of, well, I know I'm being recorded here, kind of cut a deal to make it work in the end. And that deal was that I would start doing things regarding emergency management in Washington State, start looking at state disaster funds and the legislation necessary to put in a robust system, and he would do his part. I'll do my part. And he did his part, and it was overturned. And the denial became a Stafford Act declaration that probably never should have. It was done in spite of Region 10 saying, recommended no to the President and to James Lee Witt. The ultimate irony in that, of course, is that I ended up as the director for FEMA Region 10. And when I got there, and we had our first all hands, I think they were mortified. And it's like, it's all good. You were doing your job. You were doing everything within the confines of the law, everything within that border right there. So, Sheila, that's my story. That's how I got into emergency management. It's a weird one, but in reality, none of us woke up, went through the 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, going, I'm going to be an emergency manager. We all managed to back into a similar story. Sometimes the stories are very dull, sometimes they're unbelievable. But we're in it for a reason, and for that, I'm really grateful to be here, and grateful to be in front of you sharing my thoughts. All right, so we all just got framed. You're like, what the hell is he going to talk about? Some of you may have picked up on it a little bit. We, all of us, mostly locals, to an extent the state, tribal partners, engaged tribal partners, we all got framed. And I believe that that's a good thing. There's no doubt a negative connotation to the term framed. And there should be. Individual people are framed. Agencies or departments are framed. OJ was framed. I wrote that in there. I was like, should I actually say that? Yeah, I said it. I said it. Just kidding. We're oftentimes the focus of blame for crimes, for bad deeds, for lack of involvement. Some of the greatest cries of innocence in the American judicial system have, at least in the very beginning, centered on the phrase, you don't understand. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. I was framed. Right. But in the world of the 21st century emergency manager, in our profession, a very increasingly independent and autonomous profession, being framed, I think, at this point is becoming a good thing. And my belief that that good comes from the lessons of our past, much like the Commissioner talked about this morning. Do I call you Commissioner or Directors? Commissioner?
Keith's good.
The distinguished gentleman in that. We don't have to look back decades, but just a couple of years to understand that some things went very right and some things went very wrong. So framing and being framed is going to make sense to you, I hope, at the end of this. Post-2001, we were a nation very clearly on edge, rightly so, about who we were and where we were headed in the general area of public safety. Words like coordination and interoperability were intertwined undeniably with the words first responder in ways that we hadn't seen in our nation. Citizen involvement spiked and became Citizen Corps. 7 days, 7 ways evolved from 3 days, 3 ways. See something, say something appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared with Boston, right? Everybody's like, why don't we have a campaign that says say something? They walk through the crowd. There it is. So post-September 2001, the world had changed, but we were lacking something. Something that forced national cohesion. What we needed was a plan. Big capital letters. Plan. P-L-A-N. So in 2004, May 2004, post-September 11, 2001, one of the most tragic moments in the history of our nation, we found ourselves at the mercy of the first iteration of the now defunct National Response Plan. It was a great idea for compassionate people who had great intentions, and it ended up creating a tremendous headache for states and very much so for locals. I often tell people, look what the NRP did to emergency management to local governments. Look at what it eventually did to the nation. The NRP, a plan, taught us through very hard lessons that plans, even on the largest of scales, can still be too prescriptive. A national plan can still be too prescriptive, and we'll talk about why. That stovepipes can destroy coordination during response, not just within an organization, but within the fabric of the entire nation. That designating only one branch or entity in charge can breed mistrust, defiance, and sometimes an inability to completely function. And when the role of state and local governments and those tribes are diminished, overlooked, or outright ignored, failure is almost certainly guaranteed. Plans that are so prescriptive are plans that can fail. And what we have to do is reflect back just a few years to Mike Brown and Thad Allen. Mike Brown, Director FEMA, Thad Allen, Coast Guard Admiral. Both with extraordinary capability and extraordinary responsibilities. But those roles and those responsibilities were run in parallel tracks with a brand new overlay of a very prescriptive plan, and it was set up for catastrophic failure, Katrina. And there are tons of congressional reports that we read, but what it really kind of boiled down to, at least as I see it, and I was in the midst of that to an extent, distant, but in the midst, is that those two individuals, one, didn't get along with each other. That should never deter us from operating and working with each other. But their roles and responsibilities were very different. Mike Brown was the director of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency that had come into the Department of Homeland Security with 20-plus other agencies. And there was rough going. Joe Albaugh, the previous director of FEMA, had said, I think this is going to fail. Looked at me right in the eyes and said, I think DHS is going to destroy FEMA. It didn't destroy FEMA. Looking back, it didn't. But he thought that it would dramatically change it. And on that, he was right. So Mike Brown is going down this path of I am FEMA. I have a statutory responsibility of coordination, federal assets and resources, a statutory fiduciary responsibility. I can allocate a lot of dollars. I can go recover those dollars. I can administer programs. A lot of people perceive my hat as I'm the big guy who could come in. But we now know he couldn't do that. Running that parallel track is Thad Allen, DHS. Whereas Mike Brown was a federal coordinating official set in the statutes. That's in the statutes. Go look at federal statutes. Thad Allen became a principal federal official under the National Response Plan. And that said that the principal federal official is always in charge. Appointed by the president will take charge. So Thad runs this parallel path to Mike Brown. I'm coordinating. I'm allocating resources. I'm allocating this. I'm the federal coordinating officer. It's a very traditional role for FEMA that goes back all the way to like 1988. Thad Allen says, I can pluck people off buildings. I'm tactical. I can order that to happen. I'm tactical, you're strategic. They ran down and on and on and on and on it went, and time just came undone with Katrina. And by the time that those two paths collided, it was too late. The National Response Plan, and this is the first time that I've come out and really kind of said it, bred failure that I believe hurt people in the end. Was I supportive of that plan? Yes. Because I thought that DHS was absolutely right for America, and I still do today. Absolutely, the right thing. But the plan was a little overzealous, a little too prescriptive, and hurt people. The NRP, just at the federal level alone, showed dysfunction, but it completely ignored states and locals to a very large extent. And it said in a lot of ways, don't worry, we've got it. We're in charge. It inverted, it flipped everything that kind of we thought and we knew, which was that all disasters really are local, so why is somebody going to come in and drive that train for me from the federal level? That's what it inferred very, very strongly. It implied, don't worry, we got it. All you got to do is pick up the phone and call Office of State and Local Government Coordination and Preparedness, and that liaison is going to help get you anything you want. It set aside what we all know as the traditional means that FEMA had had for years in dealing with state and locals. You put a middleman in, put somebody on the top, very prescriptive. It was the ultimate silo that today we preach about being so very bad. But it improved. In 2008, it all changed. the plan, the National Response Plan became the National Response Framework. Are we seeing my speech unfold now? We all got framed. The NRF tried and has tried to set it right, to make the adjustments that were necessary to say we had it wrong. The only thing it didn't say is we did it wrong. And I'm one of those that I think if you screw up, you just say, you know what, we really blew this. And I worked for the previous president. He was a wonderful guy, and I wish somebody in the administration would have just said, we didn't do that very well. But it is what it is today. In 2014, we have a National Response Framework. It properly readjusted the role and responsibilities of states and locals, but particularly those of us in local governments. It allows us finally to stretch in our approach to all hazard preparedness and response and recovery and mitigation and whatever else it is that we do on an everyday basis. If there's any doubt that the NRF has succeeded as a concept, what I ask us to look at is the National Preparedness Goal. Not a lot of people really get it. I mean, the preparedness goal is this big umbrella that says, here's our goal, here are these 5 things that are really important. They're mission areas. It's not necessarily preparedness. And they try to change the terminology, and that's okay. But what we've got are frameworks that are changing the way that we do business back to the way it kind of used to be. Inside the preparedness goal now, we have a National Response Framework. Good thing. A National Disaster Recovery Framework for recovery. National Mitigation Framework. National Preparedness Framework. National Prevention Framework. And the key word in each of those documents is framework. It's not so narrow, it's not so bordered in, so tight that the federal government says, you have to do it this way. Here's our strategy, here's our vision, here's our goal, and you have to do it like this. No. Here's our strategy, here's our vision, here's our goal, and here's this big framework. And you can bend it and stretch it, but we just ask politely, knowing that you hold all the keys. Am I going to have to put a password in that? That the framework would work. So my message regarding framing and being framed is, I think we're at a very critical fork in the road as emergency management professionals. My personal opinion, my professional opinion, and sometimes it runs counter to a lot of folks in DC and other areas, and that's okay, I want that dialogue, is that the framework concept is one that we ought to stick in our heart, put in our pocket, stick it in our wallet, and then put that pitchfork right into the ground and say, this is what we like. It's guidelines. It's a goalpost that can bend with the wind just enough. We can work within this. It's predictable, and it handles the unpredictable. But I think it's incumbent upon us as emergency managers at every single level to grab that and say, we like this. The greatest challenge, and I've really been blessed, in that I've been able to see all of this from multiple levels of government, from the federal level, of course, and the state level, the tribal level, certainly the 270 plus tribes in Alaska Native villages, and then the local level, starting that department from scratch. When in 2006 there was nothing, starting a department from scratch and building what you want to build. So I've got a unique view, and I think the challenge political leaders have is that they come into an office and you kind of nailed it. They want to imprint themselves onto a system. The greatest challenge, and it was a Coast Guard admiral that I went to the Naval Postgraduate School with, Pepe Castillo, who said, I said, you took over your command, what's the greatest challenge you faced? He said, doing nothing. Sometimes it just works. And people say, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to shake things up? Sometimes they don't need shaking up. Some of the greatest leadership could be revolved around just saying, what we've got in place, it's actually working. We're now in a situation in our country from emergency management, whether you have an EOC, an emergency coordination center, whatever it is you want to call it, where it's really a tale of 1 or 2 or 3, maybe 4 models. There's not a lot of difference there. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit controversial, I think, but in a good way. As the 4 that we're running, we'll talk about, but there could be dozens of models as long as there's a commonality within a framework of how we operate. That's always been the intent, but sometimes it's so prescriptive that it's just too difficult. I ask people to take a look or make a phone call to the bunkers, behind the bunkers of the FEMA regional offices, because I think they're discussing this as we speak. What are the right models for coordinating disasters in the United States. They don't have to be prescriptive, but can we have other models that work? And what's really clear is that achieving consensus in how we operate in our EOCs and our ECCs will never happen, because what's good for my organization is not going to be good for you guys, or you. It may be for you guys. And in small jurisdictions, it's even more dramatically different. What's going to work for the smallest jurisdiction might not work for somebody 4 miles across the river. That's okay. We've convoluted the system, though, so much with acronyms, refer back to that speech, that at times become so irrelevant or so confusing that they're actually abandoned. And we're left holding really not any kind of a framework at all. So, does it infer that I don't support synchronized terminology? Nope, not at all. But I approach our current state of affairs in emergency management as one of, maybe we've proverbially, with the names and the acronyms and the plans, and that we've gotten a little big for our britches, and it may be time to simplify it a little bit within that framework. We've morphed from something, as far as our EOCs, that resembled functional EOC management many, many, many years ago, to ICS, pure ICS, to amended ICS, to hybrid ICS ESF, emergency support function structures, to strict ESF structures, which, by the way, I don't think even exist. Yeah, we have 15 baseline ESFs, but you still have to manage them somehow, or do you? Even the regions in FEMA will say, we have an ESF structure. Not really, because overlaying the top of that is ICS. Finance, logistics, ops, planning, and look, all these ESFs may be changing, and that's the discussion. And what lies in the future, nobody knows. You fill in that blank. But the point is, it's time for that discussion, and it's time for the framework to allow us to put the pitchfork in the ground and say, we want to work here for a while. Keep us here. When the president leaves office in 2016, maybe one of our greatest challenges will be to educate those coming in to say, please don't change anything. What we're now seeing, as was rightly touched on, is a great theme for this conference, is back to the future. We're going back in time to simply identifying emergency management EOCs and entities and individuals who are most relevant to the success of a coordinated disaster response and transition to recovery. And everybody always talks about response, but the reality is, you as emergency managers know this. You're not just, response is here, boom, it happens. Or you can see it coming, boom, but the M eventually happens, boom, it's done. And then the recovery goes and goes and goes, right? What a lot of people don't see in our jobs is transition to recovery. The transition to recovery, where an EOC may have a strong functioning purpose for a period of time until recovery really starts to run. Very dynamic role. But it's about what matters in individual communities that I think we're beginning to refocus on, and I think that that's a good thing. The library in your community matters. In small communities, the library really matters. There's not a library ESF. The local community college in most communities is, or junior college, depending on the terminology, is a major economic driver, but they're not an ESF. The local church, the local temple, they're the cultural center of a lot of communities. And sometimes they're liaisons, but they're not an ESF. And in small communities, when you can't afford to bring in all of the ICS boxes, and you can't afford to bring in the ESFs, and you just can't afford to even turn on the lights sometimes, you have to lean on people that matter. Compton, California. Compton. I said Compton. I was in Compton, California, teaching an integrated emergency management course to that city about how to best integrate all of their systems into one cohesive, effective emergency management system. The electeds, the community, and we could go through all the stereotypes, and we could laugh about it, and actually it was pretty fun and pretty funny. And you know what Compton told me that blew me away? It's a town, it's a city, it's a community of 100,000 people with 200 churches on every corner. 200 churches. And as I poked and prodded and asked them, I said, who's important? And everybody said, oh, the church. Church on the corner. Which corner? All the corners. Every corner? They're like, go drive. And we drove churches on every corner. When a disaster strikes, they said, everybody's going to meet right there. That's where they are going. They're not going to go to shelters here, shelters there. They're going to go to the church on the corner. About Muslims, they're going to go to the church. Buddhists, going to go to the church. Didn't matter. Everybody was going to go to something on the corner. That wasn't an ESF. That wasn't an ICS box for them. It could have been. In the end, it did, because their long-term recovery, transition to recovery, and recovery plans are incorporating those. And last, as far as what's important in functional emergency management, what's important to your community, institutional knowledge. The function of institutional knowledge. The history of a community is not an emergency support function, but knowing what happened in the past, even in the middle of a response, can mean the difference between success and failure to you. So, my question is, do you know who is institutional memory and knowledge in your particular community? And the chances are you're going to go, yeah, I can lean on Bill. He knows a few things. To me, institutional knowledge is Jane. Jane is the administrative assistant to the Public Works Director. Jane has been here for 28 years. She has survived 8 Public Works Directors. Jane is administrative in nature. Jane knows how to type up any letter you want. She can answer the phone. She can direct people to where they need to go. And she sits there quietly and does her job. For 28 years, she does her job. And she is the epitome of institutional knowledge, history, memory. She gets it. There's no ESF called Jane. There is now. There is now. Because I want Jane to come into my EOC and not sit down and just do what she does every day. Jane, let's talk. You faced something like this somewhere along the way. I know. They say this river never floods in this particular area. Does it? And there's this collective drop of the shoulders, and it's, oh Lord, let me tell you about that. 1972, that river did this. These particular homes went this way, and by the way, there are 24 homes that are there now that weren't there in the past. It's not on any real map, of course, because so-and-so, the previous director, did this, that. Jane is spilling her guts. And Jane is providing vital information in the middle of a response. Institutional knowledge and history encapsulated into one individual that is so often overlooked. So my task is, go back and grab that person in your community and say, you matter. Make that person an ESF, fictional ESF, fictional ICS box. Don't let him go away. She has remained. She has knowledge. She's overlooked. She's relegated. But she needs a place in the EOC. So am I advocating the abolishment of the ICS or the ESF models for EOC? No way, absolutely not. In fact, I think within my own county, my own jurisdiction, 750,000 plus people in a lot of communities around the nation, the culture and the resources of some jurisdictions with tons of employees kind of dictates that you have to have a very rigid, structured model, like a hybrid model, that ICS overlaying ESFs. It works. We're actually in the process of changing back to functional management. Something that's going to put ESF 5, emergency management, right in the middle, like this very weird, funky kind of starfish with all these three-dimensional ESFs around it. And everybody's going to kind of funnel in. There's not going to be a lot of ICS discussion. It might be controversial, but I think it's going to work. But I've been known to be wrong in the past. So even in large organizations, I think we can now start to re-examine functional management structures as a possible option. What I'm going for here, frameworks give you options. Frameworks allow you to hear someone like me or someone else anywhere else in the country and say, I like that. I think I can make that work within that framework. So, we have options. Far from prescriptive plans, that's a good thing. All right. What it all boils down to for us as emergency managers, and I don't even like the term emergency managers, I think we're emergency management professionals. Yeah, sometimes we get down and dirty, but it's a profession that's evolving and emerging, and I like it, is that we have no power. We have no power. We all are pretty much strategic, and it's taken about 20 years for, I think, all of the first responder community public safety to finally get that emergency management is not tactical. We can't go out and pull the head boots on and necessarily do all the sand and sandbagging ourselves, because It's larger than that. It's a good bit of a 100,000-foot view regardless. That's what your ultimate goal is. Sometimes you still have to do that tactical stuff, of course. But it all boils down to we're powerless leaders with nothing to offer other than motivation, coordination, some skill, and pure hope that others are going to follow. Powerless leaders. Eric Holdeman, who is the former director of King County Emergency Management, kind of the Seattle metro area, big, just ginormous, redonkulous, large county of mess. It is, and they need a lot to manage that. He managed it for a lot of years. He led it for a lot of years. He actually wrote in Emergency Management magazine that is our lot in life. We are basically powerless leaders. And then he gave solutions, how we get through that. And I just want to share them very briefly, and then I'm done. Eric Holdeman said, we lead without authority. How you do that is you first and foremost understand the limits of your own authority. A lot of it is defined by statute or code, federal law sometimes, but the point is understanding what are the limits of my authority. What can I do? What can't I do? A lot of people will stray and break those rules in the end. Sometimes that's okay. Ask for forgiveness later. Go to prison, you'll get good lunches, get out, you did the right thing. But understand the limits of your authority. Second, lead by example. Does it mean that you have to get into the ditch and put sand in the sandbags? No. Should you once in a while? Maybe. Lead by example. Here's how we do it. Or, I don't know how to do this, show me. I want to try this. Lead by example. Focus on relationships. Without my staff, I can't make it. Without my deputy director, I can't make it. Focusing on that relationship with her and my senior staff at my department. Without them, I fail. Without volunteers, I doubly fail. Without them there, my mission will not succeed. Be transparent about your intentions. If it is your intention to build a county-wide Department of Emergency Management and pull fragmented pieces that have existed since the Paleolithic era, but your intentions are to pull us all together, and you know it's going to be controversial, at least be clear about your intentions. I want to do this. And then use those techniques that she just talked about. What I hear you saying is, oh, what I hear you saying is. Be clear about your intentions. Like, I'm going to make you whole. No. Being clear about your intentions is, you were hit and my heart bleeds for you and it is going to hurt for a long time. Disaster has a definition attached to it and you are in the midst of it. I'm clearly conveying to you this is going to be painful, but we're going to be there for you. We're going to do everything we can for you. We're going to get through it together. I'm not going anywhere. Clearly communicating. Developing a selling technique. Somebody mentioned earlier type A and type B personalities. Amen. The reality is, we may all think we're type B personalities. We're not. We're all type A's to an extent in emergency management. The challenge that you face is if you have more than about 2 or 3 or 4 employees, that a lot of times those type A personalities, if they don't have a disaster to work on, will kill each other. They are looking for something to do that's got jackets on, and I'm in my truck, and I got my 800 radio, and I'm doing my thing, and I'm coordinating, and I'm in... But those relationships within that environment become really critical. And you as a leader have to look and say, I see that structure getting a little wobbly. So you're working those relationships. And you know that Tom is just a different person to deal with than is Bill, than is Tammy. And you're working those relationships. The interpersonal relationships, many of the things that she talked on. Developing that selling technique. That's how you're working with them. I sell to Tammy that relationship. I sell that different than I do Tom. It's different phraseology, different words. Next, building partners with individuals and organizations. Without the American Red Cross, the local chapters of the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, LDS, on, you won't succeed. Not enough money in this room, not enough budget allocated to us to make us succeed. So building partnerships, and you know that. That's a no-brainer. Last is learning to find common ground. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. I don't have to win. There are fire chiefs that really, truly hated my guts when I came in because I'm young and brash and full of piss and vinegar, and I'm like, hey, I'm actually pretty calm compared to the way I was in 1994. And we had to find common ground, and they didn't want to find common ground because they were set in their ways. And I was sort of beginning to be set in my ways, but we had to find common ground. And once you can do that, applying, communicating clearly, being transparent, selling technique, that long-term relationship. Let me just buy you a cup of coffee. Let's go have a chat. What is this all about? And hopefully, your organization will have people that will empower you with that leadership. Because my comprehensive emergency management plan can make me essentially powerful enough to do one thing. Ask for everyone to come to the table. Ask for everyone to come to the EOC. I do have some authority. But what I'm hoping is that they have entrusted in me leadership skills and confidence to the point they hand it over and say, we will follow. And we've been through 7 Stafford Act presidential disaster declarations in 7 years. 7 of them. Tough ones. And so far that has worked. And that's on top of 15 federal ones prior to coming in. Quick stat, Snohomish County, Washington. Just north of Seattle, Boeing. That's all you need to know, Boeing. Prone to disasters, most flood-prone county in all of FEMA Region 10, Oregon, Idaho, Alaska, and Washington. And we've had our share of issues where I've had to lead on the fly. I didn't have confidence in myself. I employed some of these techniques, and in the end, those fire chiefs that didn't like me came and said, we think this might work. Where'd you learn this? Tough challenges. The stat is that in the 6-month period between 2008 and 2009, 6 months, we broke every record in our history books for snow, floods, and heat. All within 6 months, broke all 3 of them. Climate change happening? Yeah, it is. At least where I live, it's killing us. So, that's it. The last thing, develop a strategic narrative for emergency management, not a strategic plan. What I would ask of you is to consider developing a story. Tell the story. Prior to having your strategic plan or addressing frameworks and the things that we've talked about, tell the story for the people, for the elected officials. Have a strategic narrative for emergency management. What really turned me on about this concept of a strategic narrative is something called a national strategic narrative by Mr. Y. If you get a chance, write that down and go look at it. Because what these 2 military officers who used the name Mr. Y said in their authoring of this is that there are 5 ways that we need to change as a nation, telling our story. We're not 1776, we're not 1836, we're not 1865, we're not the Civil Rights era of 19. This is a new era. How do we tell the national narrative? And I keep coming back to, how do we tell our story of emergency management to those we serve and those we report to and to the public at whole? A narrative. This is a great document, and I hope you have a chance to look at it because I'm done, and I want to wrap up. But I wanted to go into this, and I'll just put it online and maybe push it out through the association, some of the thoughts that I've had on it, if you're okay with that. So, that's me, that's us. But why is this all so important? This is me concluding. Because what we do matters. There are people that depend on us. We have a website called Who Depends on You, and the objective was very simple. It's reframe it. It's not, oh, are you going to help me? Well, hang on. Eileen, who depends on you? And when you reframe that, it puts the pressure on that individual. Who depends on you? There are those that depend on us. They are the grandparents. They are children. They are the neighborhoods. They are the communities. They are those with challenges. They are pets. We now know that. They are the deeply, deeply vulnerable in the truest sense. Non-politically correct, deeply vulnerable people that are depending upon us. They are our culture. They are our heritage. If you don't think that those things don't depend on emergency management, rethink it. Civilizations disappear. Farming will disappear after a disaster. Are we planning for farming? Are we planning on more than just the Historical Preservation Act dictating to us how we preserve certain things? How do we preserve our cultures? So, there are people that depend on us. Basically, all that we hold dear depends upon us. So, that's me. I hope this has made sense. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for what you do, for paying attention. Sometimes, at that very tactical level, a lot of times at the very strategic level, you are able to address minutia while rising up to that 100,000 foot level, and that is very difficult to do. I do thank you for your compassion, because I know that we're not just a bunch of rigid, former department directors of this who just happen to be drawing a second pension. That's not it. That's not it. There's a lot of compassion that's in our discipline, and it's growing more and more. I do thank you for your vision, seeing those things that are unseen by wonderful but oftentimes very tactical eyes. I thank you for taking budget cuts with a smile and figuring out how you can still do your job and then complete that mission. I thank you for waiting to have your budget restored, right? First in line, last to have it restored. That's a rule of thumb for emergency management. You're making sure everybody else is square before you decide to go in and really push the buttons. Some communities will change that around every once in a while, but it's what happens. I thank you very much for placing a target upon yourself and your department for the elected officials, for the public, and for the media, because that's what we're all wearing. Mine's underneath, it's on the back side today. But we all have a target on us. That's okay. We knew it coming in. There's a lot of passion in what we do, but there's also a lot of high risk. I really thank you, my last one, for standing for what you believe, for standing your ground at times, even against those who just need to be pushed back. And it happens where they have to be pushed back, and you have to be allowed just to do your job, even at the risk of losing it. And if we apply Eric Coleman's principles and his thoughts and concepts of clearly communicating and sharing your intent, then I think you'll be okay. I've had to deal with some pretty tough situations where I've said, not going to happen. No. You're a bully. Can you please leave my EOC? You hired me to do this job. I promise I won't fail you, but you need to stand out of the way and let me do that. As I'm starting to pack that bag over there, but boy, I really blew it. So, with that, thank you so much. God bless you for what you do. It's nice to be back in Utah, nice to be back in Salt Lake City, and I'm open for a few questions if there's any time. So, thank you very much.
Have any questions?